You've likely thought about your heart health at some point and even the health of your brain, but what about the health of your liver? On this week's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, we're sitting down with Kristin Kirkpatrick to discuss exactly that. We're going to cue our introduction and we're going to dive right into this conversation. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast, brought to you by Exercise for Life Studios, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. We're your hosts, Charlie
and Julie.
And this week we are diving into the topic of liver health and how to create a healthy liver for life. And we have an amazing guest who is going to walk us through key elements of her book, Regenerative Health, Discover Your Metabolic Type and Renew Your Liver for Life. And that guest is Kristin Kirkpatrick. Kristin Kirkpatrick is a best-selling author, presenter, president, and CEO of CAC Nutrition Consulting, and a dietitian with the Department of Wellness and Preventative Medicine at Cleveland Clinic. She has appeared on The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, and Fox News, among others, and has contributed to publications such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Time. In her free time, Kristin enjoys running, hiking, skiing, and spending time with her husband, sons, and dogs in their home outside of Denver, Colorado.
Before we jump in, we want to invite you to join our upcoming OWA. It starts on Sunday, April 28th. It's going to be called Pumped and Powerful. We're going to be working on strength training, building our power, and of course, we're always going to be using the Exercise for Life principles so that these exercises can be applied to any type of body and to make sure that you stay safe and productive with your strength training. To get signed up, go to www.exerciseforlifestudios.com/OWA. And now to our interview.
Well, Kristin, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and have the opportunity to communicate with your audience.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I'm really excited about today's conversation because, the longest time, heart health has been a really big thing. Maybe the last, say, 15, maybe 20-ish years, brain health has been, more of a thing. Maybe the last 10 years or so, metabolic health has been a thing. But your book is all about liver health, which is not something that we hear about all too much. Actually, I was kind of laughing to myself when I was thinking about it because it's kind of like the two times in life where we think about liver health is maybe in our late teens to late 20s when we think, wow, I'm really taxing my liver. And then later in life, if we're like, wow, I've really overtaxed my liver. Now I need to do something about it. But kind of in between those two times, people really don't think about their liver all that much. So why the liver? What's so special about it?
Why the liver? So the liver is so special. And just talking about the heart health and the brain health, if your liver isn't functioning well, Charlie, those things won't work either. So that's let's just bring that up. But to your point, I remember when I wrote my first book, which was Skinny Liver, also about liver health. And I was thinking for years, I really want to write a book. What do I write it about? I had all these weight loss concepts. And then finally I landed on the liver. And when people would say, what's your book about? I would kind of avert my eyes and be like, it's about the liver, right? Apologetically. And really though, the reason that this was so important was because at Cleveland Clinic and Integrative Medicine, I was getting one patient after the next that was coming in and saying the same thing. And that was, I went to my doctor, my liver enzymes are up. He also said that I have risk factors. I probably have something called fatty liver. There's no medication and there's no cure for it outside of lifestyle. So here I am. So really, it was kind of a call to action for me that we didn't have anything that related to this. We didn't have anything that really looked at the liver and helped with the healing process because we didn't think about it as much. So that was really kind of the motivation. Why did I want to talk about the liver? Because no one else had. So that, so that was really one of the reasons why this was so important. And to your point, we don't think about it unless we're drinking and think, oh gosh, my liver is really taking a beating right now because I'm drinking too much. I'll just drink less. But really, if you think about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, it has nothing to do with drinking and has to do completely with lifestyle.
Wow. Yeah. And I know you get into non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in the book quite a bit. I do want to talk with you about that. But one thing that you brought up in the book was the number of functions that the liver has, because a lot of times we just think, oh, the liver just kind of detoxes us. And detox is a very kind of hyped up
term right now, whether it's like, sitting in saunas or doing, we think of like our skin and sweating as detox, and we think of like our liver maybe as detox, but there's so much more to it than that. So can you kind of go into actually the importance of the liver?
Yeah, sure. So the liver is actually involved in every single metabolic process that the body has. So that's kind of number one. It is involved in blood sugar management. So when the liver or when the body in general assesses that your blood sugar is too low, the liver actually will work as a function to release blood sugar to be able to make sure that blood sugar becomes more stabilized. It's involved in lipids. It is involved in blood clotting. We mentioned the detox, but that is a huge part of it as well. Just because walking out of our house, we have the need for detoxing, right? We come out to toxins every place we go. It's in our food, it's in the air. And so that's a really big component as well. But really, anything you think about from a dietitian standpoint, when you eat something, oftentimes we think stomach and the microbiome, and those are all really important factors. But the liver plays a role in every single component there. What happens to fat, what happens to sugar, et cetera. So I think the reason we don't think about it too much is because this is an organ that takes a beating and just keeps working for you until it can't.
Interesting. Okay. And so with that in mind, again, you brought up non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. How prevalent is that? And like, how early is that starting with a lot of people? Because I'm guessing there's a lot of stages before you actually get to that end diagnosis.
Yeah. So right now, the estimates are about 1 in 4 individuals, so about 25% globally of the population. Now, we think those estimates are probably pretty low. It's probably much higher because, we know that there are plenty of people that are undiagnosed that have insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. And so that is a huge risk factor for fatty liver disease. In terms of how early you can get it, I know that my co-author, Dr. Hanane, he has seen patients as young as 8 come in with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Wow.
And to your point, Charlie, this is a really slow growing condition, which is great. That's the good news here. It takes a really long time for us to go through the stages, and people live in that first stage quite a long time. But the problem is when kids get it, kids live a long time. And so if you get it at 8 and you don't make any lifestyle change and you continue on with kind of the progression in your 40s, then you're much more likely that you could start seeing some downfall of this. So not to say that it's more concerning in kids than it is in adults, but they live longer than adults.
Sure.
They have more time on their hands, and that doesn't work in their advantage. So there's 3 stages to it. Essentially, the first stage is just having an abnormal amount of fat in the liver. And that's about 5 to 10% over the norm. Once we get into the second stage, what happens is the liver's trying to heal itself. That healing process creates scar tissue, and the scar tissue then replaces healthy liver tissue. And when we get to and that's more like looking at NASH, inflammatory. Once we get past that, then we are looking at the stage of cirrhosis. And cirrhosis is not reversible. You're looking at a liver transplant at that point. So it's slow growing. Very few people reach cirrhosis, but we have such a great opportunity to completely reverse the condition.
And at that point, if somebody gets to the point of cirrhosis, is it that their liver just fails, it isn't working anymore, or it's working so suboptimally that it's not able to keep up? Kind of what is ultimately the end result?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So cirrhosis is a state where basically the healthy liver tissue is being replaced by cirrhotic tissue. So by tissue that has no function. Once it is complete cirrhosis and you have 0 liver function, that is why you need a transplant. I mean, you just can't live anymore. So it goes back to that connection to the heart, to the brain, to every other component that we have. Once the liver stops working, everything else does as well. So again, that's pretty rare to see, but a cirrhotic liver looks almost black, almost like you put it in something and someone has smoked it, as opposed to like the beautiful kind of red shininess that the liver is supposed to have. It's the replacement of the tissue, and once it gets replaced, it simply can't follow any kind of function anymore.
Wow. Okay. So you brought up, children showing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Is that strictly lifestyle based for them? Is there a genetic component? And then how does that translate into what you see with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease with adults?
Yeah, so there could be genetics. There's, with any kind of disease status that we look at, genetics can always play a role in some component, and it definitely plays some sort of role here in the formation of NAFLD. Now, I will say this, that things like type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, there could be some genetic predisposition there, and that's then what kind of puts you over the edge to NAFLD as well.
Mm,
Um, but in terms of the genetics, it's really interesting. We found studies looking at really prenatal nutrition and a prenatal state. So moms that had gestational diabetes and some fatty liver, or just fatty liver alone, their offspring were much more likely to develop fatty liver later in
mm,
life, even if they didn't have a high waist circumference.
mm,
So what we're seeing in kids, what is really kind of drawing this on, is really it parallels the increase that we're seeing in insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes with children as well. So
Wow.
as we see obesity in children, especially waist circumference being high,
Mhm.
that then goes into this cascade of inflammatory factors that could lead to diabetes, insulin resistance, etc. If you are type 2 diabetic, you're about 80% likely to have fatty liver as well. So
Mm,
this is why we're seeing such a jump. In terms of like the difference between kids and adults,
mhm.
kids are really challenging in some ways. I remember I was an obese child. I was insulin resistant. It's what really drew me to become a dietitian later in
Mhm.
life. And what we've learned is that telling a kid to restrict something isn't healthy. It's not healthy for their
Sure.
mental status. It's not something that we can expect them to achieve. And it's not a good idea. So we have to communicate to kids a little differently and really focus on health. And truly, the focus has to be on the parents, because
Mm,
the
mhm.
parents, like, I don't know if you have kids, I do.
Yeah.
And I have 100% control pretty much what they're eating at
Yep.
this point, right? So they're young
Mhm.
enough where I still have that control. So when we see someone who's 8 years old, it's really looking at consultation with the parents, not so much the child. And how can the family come together to have some better eating habits that can trickle down to
Mhm.
that child?
Yeah, I can appreciate that. So what it sounds to me like is there may be a genetic component, but it sounds like a lot of it is in our own hands as far as like what we can do from a
Absolutely.
lifestyle
Yeah.
perspective. And that's what I picked up from your book as well. And I know you go into something called like the four metabolic types and kind of different eating around that. Can we dive into that a little bit about the four metabolic types?
Yeah, so the formation of the four metabolic types really came after both Dr. Hananay and myself. We were seeing patients, and when we went into the chart to look at kind of their status and review them before the appointments, we would always see whether or not they were classified as underweight, overweight, obese, and
Hmm.
that would always be dictated by one number, and that was BMI.
Mhm.
So what we know now is that BMI is not a good indicator of
Hmm.
health, that
Hmm.
you could have a normal BMI and still be carrying too much waist circumference that's a little too high. So we decided instead to look at metabolic type specific to fatty liver and based on your waist circumference. And we came up with
Interesting.
four. So
Okay.
it's an essential breakdown where if you have a high waist circumference, higher than normal, and your metabolic numbers are abnormal in any capacity. So
Mhm.
if we break down metabolic syndrome, we know you have to have two of the components of metabolic syndrome. So a low HDL, triglycerides are going to be high, hemoglobin A1C is going to be high, lipids. Those are some of the numbers that we look at. So we kind of compared all of those things with lean and non-lean individuals. And then from
Hmm.
there, kind of dictated what's the plan, what's kind of your destiny in terms of what should we try next. So what we wanted to really focus here is that for anyone that has been told you're overweight or you're obese, and it's been something told on the basis of BMI,
Mhm.
it's not a really good starting point, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
waist circumference is much more telling, because our waist circumference tells where our fat lies. And when our
Mm.
fat lies near organs, that's when we start to get in trouble.
Sure. Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. And I know you also have kind of like a risk assessment questionnaire in the book where you're going to rate yourself on, like how much of these foods you're eating, and how active you are and everything like. How do those things play into NAF LD? What do you call it? NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Yeah. So I think they play into it, very significantly, because I think sometimes, and this is like, as a dietitian, this might be surprising to hear, but it's like, it's so much more than food.
Mhm.
So we ask about a lot of things, do you smoke? What's your activity level? Things like that. How is your sleeping look?
Yeah.
Because when patients come to me and say, gosh, I'm so unhealthy, so I know I need to change my diet. Really, I oftentimes will stop them there and say, okay, let's have a conversation about your diet, but tell me some other things first. Tell me about how you were fed as a child. Tell me what your
Mhm.
sleep habits look like. Tell me how you're managing stress.
Mhm.
Um, so there's so much that goes into, let's call it, our health span. So how long we live in a healthy manner. And food is a huge component. I'm biased as a dietitian. I think it's probably one of the main components, but it's not the only component. So
Mhm.
all of those other things in the risk assessment are really just there to kind of highlight those things and give individuals
Sure.
more of a better perspective.
So a couple that really stood out to me, or I guess jumped off the page more, was you asked about coffee, and specifically like non-sweetened like black coffee, and then sleep, like how much sleep you're having. So how do those two? Is there a direct correlation between like how much coffee you're drinking and how your liver is functioning, and then same with sleep?
Yeah. There is a direct correlation with both of those related to liver health. There's been over a dozen studies looking at coffee consumption, both caffeinated and decaffeinated options, in terms of overall liver health. So what we know is that the individuals that drink the most coffee tend to have the best livers. Tends to be the
Nice.
perspective. Yeah, right. So like coffee in front of me today, but
Let's go.
let's go, right?
Yeah.
So this is like a huge thing, because when we talk, I get this question all the time. Like when I'm doing media interviews, someone will say, oh, what's the best superfood that's trending right now? And it's like, well, my answer is probably gonna be a little boring because it's coffee. So coffee
Mm,
has so many bioactive compounds. Remember, it's still coming from a plant. And so one of the limitations of coffee is the caffeine. If you're someone who, from a nutrigenomic standpoint, is a slow metabolizer of caffeine, then you should have less, obviously,
mm,
right? So that's
mhm.
kind of a separate conversation. But the studies are very clear. 2 to 5 cups of coffee a day, if it's tolerated, tend to help to reverse fibrosis, which is that second
Wow.
stage, uh,
Yeah.
and help with overall liver health. So that's number one.
Mm,
Number two,
nice.
sleep. More than a dozen studies on sleep in relation to cravings, dietary patterns, and our ability to actually burn fat.
Hmm,
So we know that when we either get low quality sleep or the hours of sleep are inconsistent, then what happens is we are more likely to crave hyperpalatable foods, things that are
gotcha.
sweet, salty. It's kind of like if you've ever had an all-nighter and the
Mhm.
next day you wake up, you're like, wow, I could eat a whole pizza. And no one's like, wow, where's the kale salad? Right?
Right.
No one.
Yeah.
So, so that's a great indicator of like where our head is when we don't get sleep. But studies also show, and I think this is really interesting. My husband and I like complain about this all the time. We keep getting in debates about this. Is that consistent sleep is also really important. So let's say you're working traditional work schedule, and Monday through Friday, you're sleeping 7 hours. And then Saturday and Sunday, you decide, I'm going to catch up. I'm going to sleep in. I'm going to get 15 hours. We know that's really damaging. So you have to
Mm,
go to bed and wake up at the same time every single day,
mm,
including the weekends. So
okay.
quality sleep, which we go into, and then consistency in sleep is really important.
Nice. That's really good to know. That's really good to know. I know again, you talk a lot about diet in the book, and you compare so the recommendations that you're giving to a lot of kind of like popular diets now, or diets that have been popular, ketogenic, lower carb, Mediterranean, everything like that. Can you give us like an overview of like, hey, this is the idea of how to be eating to make sure that your liver stays healthy, stays functioning well?
Yeah. So, really number one, there's no size fits all approach. Different
Hmm.
people are going to react differently in terms of long-term sustainability to different dietary patterns. So, something could work great for someone and not for someone else. But what we wanted to do is really kind of comb through the research and look at what was the best diet for blood sugar management. Because
Mm,
if we could achieve better blood sugar management, then we could achieve better liver health and we could start to
mm,
reverse this condition.
sure.
So the studies are really clear that moderate to low carb approaches tend to be really beneficial for overall blood sugar management. We've seen studies that have been randomized control trials, meta-analysis, that look at 6 to 12 months of data and look at really kind of the remission of diabetes in certain individuals
Mm,
with a low or moderate carb diet. But we also didn't want to be really restrictive because people don't really respond well to restrictiveness. So what
mm,
we did was we said, okay, what's the best diet for the liver overall? And that's the Mediterranean diet, without doubt.
mhm,
And
mm,
then we kind of broke it down to, okay, here's a moderate carb Mediterranean diet. Here's what that looks like. So we
mm.
still have the Mediterranean components,
Yeah.
but we are taking a few extra steps to help with our blood sugar management. And let
Mhm.
me just say, a moderate carb approach is about 45% of your calories coming from carbohydrates.
Oh,
So
that's still quite a bit.
that's a lot. That's a lot,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
low goes down to about 25%. So,
Okay.
so it's really what we're not doing is saying, hey, you got to be on a keto diet if you want a healthy liver. You
Sure.
can, if that's something you want to explore. There could be some challenges with long-term sustainability there, but like really, if we just go like straight down the fairway, Mediterranean diet,
Mhm.
and let's look at where we can modify some of the carbohydrates,
Yeah.
that could be the best approach.
Yeah. No, I can appreciate that. When I was in grad school, my professor had a PhD in nutrition, and one of his books was, around diet and exercise, but he kind of asked the same question from a longevity perspective, and his conclusion was a Mediterranean style diet was,
Yeah.
best for kind of like meeting all the required nutrients that your body needs in order to function optimally and from a longevity perspective. So I think there's a lot of similarities there between what you're seeing, what he saw, so I can appreciate that a whole bunch.
Hard to
I
beat it.
think a lot of, yeah, yeah. So I think a lot of people have in their mind, still to this day, this question about fat, and especially when a name of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease comes up,
Yeah.
there can be some like, well, okay, you're telling me like eat more, closer to keto maybe, but that's a lot of fat, and is that going to affect my liver? So can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so fat doesn't make you fat. Right. We know that now. And we even know that there has been some kind of misguided data. If we go back to the 80s, where fat was really vilified in things like heart disease. Whereas now we know that really sugar was more of a culprit than fat ever was in
Mhm.
any components, right? So I think, for us, we don't want people to be on an extreme high fat diet. That's not the point of what we're trying to achieve, even though that can be kind of challenging when you go more low carb, right? The more you take
Mhm.
a
Sure.
macronutrient away, the more another macronutrient goes up, right? So
Mhm.
that's pretty normal to see. But what we really wanted to focus on were like the healthy fats. So, for example, I tell my patients I have them having 3 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil every day, whether
Nice.
they are someone who is struggling with NAFLD or they're just metabolically healthy. There are so many polyphenols, there's so much data, there's so many studies on extra virgin olive oil. So
Mhm.
really it's about education. How do you find the best approach to
Mhm.
extra virgin olive oil? Like how do you go to the grocery store and buy one that's actually good? Uh,
Sure.
number one. And then number two, how do you get it in? So
Mhm.
so we really wanted to focus on healthy fats, healthy oils, avocado, nuts and seeds, etc. And not to say we say in our book, hey, you can never have red meat or red processed
Mhm.
meat, because I don't like the concept of food being good or bad. But
Mhm.
that is something where we would say, okay, let's try and limit that while we increase some of the healthier fats.
Mhm. Awesome. Awesome. I can appreciate that very much. Kristen, this is absolutely fascinating. One thing that you brought up right away, I'm going to flip open the book because I literally believe it's the very first sentence. Um, well, actually, Spider-Man was the very first sentence, but talking about in the first section was about how the liver can actually regenerate itself.
Yes.
And given the right environment, given the right nutrients, like the things that you talk about from an issue perspective with the liver, there's so much opportunity for people to help themselves. Can you speak on that and just the power that the liver has to actually get healthy?
Yeah, it's such a like bounce back type of organ. And I have to
Mhm.
say, I'm not a physician, but I am so blessed to be working with Dr. Hanane, who is a world-class hepatologist. And it's so, I mean, like he tells me these stories all the time and they never get boring. Like he tells me about these liver transplants where a loved one will donate a portion of their liver to
Mhm.
someone who needs a transplantation, a partial transplantation. And he said within a few weeks both livers are back to normal size.
Wow, that is so quick.
It's mind-boggling. A few
That's
weeks.
crazy.
So the liver is the only organ in the body that can regenerate. And it's one of the
Mm,
reasons why we wanted to have the word regenerate within our main title, because it is such
mhm.
an amazing, awesome power that the liver has that no other organ has. So it does regenerate. I did say it takes a beating, and it definitely does take a beating. And, it will break down if you continue to beat it up. We have
Sure,
plenty of people that have died because of overconsumption of alcohol, right? There's no doubt
sure,
about
sure.
that. But if you stop and you say, I really want to focus on this organ, take care of this organ, it
Mm.
will kind of take a breather and say, I'll work with you on it. Right. So
Mm.
it will give you that opportunity to reverse it. And you have a lot of opportunity before you get to that cirrhotic stage.
Awesome. No, I can appreciate that very much. The book is Regenerative Health. I'm holding it if you're watching us on YouTube right now. Discover your metabolic type and renew your liver for life. Kristin, this has been fascinating. Where can people get a copy of this book? Where can they connect with you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, they get a copy at Amazon, Barnes and Noble. They can connect with me on my website, KristinKirkpatrick.com, Kristin spelled with an I, or on social media, Fuel Well with Chrissy.
Awesome. Fantastic. We'll put all those links in the show notes for this episode. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you around your book, the liver, your work?
Yeah, I would say, let's not forget our humanness throughout our entire
Mm,
process of trying to change any kind of behavior, dietary behavior, sleep, things like that. I have yet to meet one person that didn't fall off the wagon when they were trying to change their diet, and that's
sure.
okay. So,
Hmm.
I oftentimes will tell people like, I have fallen off the wagon a million times, but what kind of differentiates that from something else is that I'm able to get back on.
Hmm.
So believe me, I love a Krispy Kreme donut just like the rest person,
Sure.
but it's
Yeah.
like, so kind of like, how do we take our personal preferences, our cultural, our religious preferences, and still enjoy those things while
Yeah.
still really focusing on a nutrient dense diet? There's a way to do that.
Absolutely. I love it. And you lay out a great path for us within this book. So thank you for that. Kristen, the question that we like wrapping up with for all of our guests is, what is your definition of health?
I think my definition of health is waking up every day and being excited to choose healthy foods and to
Mm.
move your body, as opposed
Yeah.
to dreading those things.
Mm, hmm.
Because if those are something that you embrace, that you enjoy, then finding health will be much easier. But if it's
That
something
is
that
so true.
forced, right? If you say like,
Yep.
I have to go for a walk and I hate it, or I have to eat. I have all these patients that say like, you're going to make me eat kale, aren't you? And I'm like, not if you don't like it. Like, let's take the nutrients that are in kale and I'm going to give you 5
Mhm.
other vegetables and let's see if you like
Yeah.
those, right?
Yeah.
So I think we have to enjoy the choices that we make on our path to a longer health span.
I love that. Absolutely. Well, Kristen, this has been such a fun conversation. Absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been such an honor and a privilege to be with you.
One of my favorite aspects of that interview is how simple Kristen made everything. Whether you are brand new to this idea of thinking about living a life that is conducive for your liver health, or you are somebody who's been thinking about the health of your liver for quite some time now, the information that Kristin gave during this interview, as well as in her book, is absolutely fantastic. So if you haven't already, be sure to grab a copy of Kristin's newest book, Regenerative Health, right from Amazon. We put the link to that in the show notes below this episode, so be sure to check that out. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to us and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find our podcast when they're looking for information on exercise and they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us a 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.